Hi, everyone. Welcome to Us in Flux Conversations from the Center for Science and the Imagination at Arizona State University. My name is Bob Beard. I'm a project manager at the center, where we use the tools of speculative fiction to get people thinking more optimistically about the future. And Us in Flux is our response to this very odd timeline in which we find ourselves. Every week, we publish a short story that explores themes of community, collaboration, and collective imagination in response to transformative events. And then we host a public discussion to go deeper into these topics. And we have a great panel lined up this afternoon to talk about the latest story for Us in Flux, a short, sweet tale called Skating Without Streetlights by Tina Connolly. Tina is a science fiction and fantasy writer and a poet. She's the author of the Iron Skin trilogy from Tor Books and the Seriously Wicked series from Tor Teen. Her stories and novels have been finalists for the Hugo, the Nebula, the Locus, and the World Fantasy Awards. And she's one of the co-hosts of the Escape Pod podcast and runs the Parsec-winning Flash Fiction podcast, Toast. Tina, nice to see you.
Nice to see you. Thank you.
And at the center of Tina's story is an advanced form of virtual reality / augmented reality technology. So we wanted to bring in our friend and frequent collaborator, Dennis Bonilla, to help us think through some of these exciting ideas presented in the story. Dennis is the Chief Technology Officer for Baltu Technologies, where he oversees the development of future of work applications for rapidly upskilling people using immersive technology. He has 20 years of experience creating data visualization softwares and decision support systems for NASA and other US agencies, and has served in roles supporting committees advising US President Barack Obama about options for future human spaceflight. Dennis is also adjunct faculty at Arizona State University, informing students how to develop video games and interactive systems to create joy, develop community, and better understand the world around them. That's a lot. Dennis, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
So we're going to chat for a bit and then turn to audience questions later in the hour. At any time, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen to share some of your observations or to post questions. And we'll look forward to hearing from you. So first of all, for folks who haven't read Skating Without Streetlights, Tina, can you talk a little bit about the story and your inspiration for writing it?
Sure. Well, when we first started talking about this project, Bob, you and Joey at ASU said you were trying to do something that would talk about hopeful things in the future, about community and about connection. And I was like, great, because pretty much all I've been able to read these days or watch are things that, you know, are hopeful, things that are about people working hard to try to do the right thing and to try to build that community, build that connection. You know, a story doesn't have to be a laugh a minute, it has to, but right now for me, I have to find things that say people are genuinely trying to work to find ways to help each other, ways to do better. So I immediately started thinking about all these video calls we've been doing now. And I have to say, I myself have sort of just ramped widely up on video calls. Like 2 months ago, we had very terrible internet at home, and I almost never did any. And when I did, I often would feel like, kind of like, oh, anxious and what's going on, and am I smiling too much or not enough? Who knows? It was all weird and different. And 2 months later, I'm like, oh yeah, I got this. But I wanted to talk about a girl in the future who maybe has similar feelings, not about video calls, but about VR calls in this case. And what would happen if she found that that technology could allow her to make actually connections and positive communication and build community in the future.
Excellent. And so Dennis, you work on the cutting edge of VR technology. And so I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about how Tina's story rhymes with the developments that you're seeing in your industry.
Yeah, so I think the story does a really good job of use cases that are going to appear for the tech, whether it's collaboration, virtual collaboration, or storytelling. I think the way Tina's written it is pretty kind of true to form as far as what we're expecting for adoption to look like. So basically meaning what are the ways in which augmented reality and virtual reality make sense, instead of just kind of trying to wedge them into, like, oh, this is going to suddenly, making a sandwich suddenly is going to look different because you have VR. It's, although I like stories like that, I like what Tina did as far as someone that may be having some difficulty with adoption or second guessing certain forms of tech, and then finding a use case that works for them. And that really speaks to the way we think about tech, kind of moving away from just the tech itself, but what are comfortable ways in which a person can use these immersive technologies.
Thank you, Dennis. Yeah, so in the story, my main character, Mila, does not like VR. She'd prefer to be out on her bike, biking all around. But then she gets home one day and her sister, Leanna, has a migraine and can't do her virtual reality hospital volunteering. And so that's her baby step into, okay, I guess I'll try this out, even though I really don't like it at all. Yeah.
You talked about this a little bit, Tina, about how like we've all ramped up with our Zoom use and our video calling. And I think it's really interesting because previous visions of the future have always shown us a world where video calling is ubiquitous, right? It's in Trek, it's in the Jetsons. It's like, that is sort of the signifier for we are in the future, because look at these video calls that are happening. But now that we have it, we see not only how messy it is, but also the interesting ways that it's being deployed in all sorts of unexpected ways. I recently read that there's an organization that matches kids learning to read with shelter dogs. So the kids read to dogs over Zoom and provide some human contact to the animals, but then there's a benefit to them because they're practicing their skills in front of a non-judgmental audience, which is just, wow. I mean, it's just, it's such a great use of a technology that was previously, just used for like distributed workplaces. And I think it's like, it's the William Gibson quote, right? Like the street finds its uses. So I wonder like if we might talk about the future of VR, right? And like when I was, first exposed to VR, it was like at a state fair, right? And then the next time I saw VR, it was being used by a realtor. So like, Dennis, can we talk a little bit about that, about sort of the new and unexpected uses for VR?
Yeah, and so what's happening in the industry is actually a kind of coalescing of what's called sensor fusion technologies. So sensors are getting really, really inexpensive, right? Like under $1 to produce these sensors that can now track the way you move or the way your body, your body moves in a space or the way your face moves. And so the tech is actually kind of changing its name from AR and VR, so augmented reality and virtual reality, to now this XR thing. And so those in the industry are just calling all of this stuff XR, which is extended reality. So whether a person gets turned into a cartoon in real time, or they can virtually build a car, it's all kind of falling under this XR nomenclature. And so the use cases are getting very, very wide. Like it used to be that you would use VR if it was something super, super dangerous or super, super complex to display. And now it's kind of going back to kind of more simple forms. Like Tina's written, hey, I want to have myself as a hologram in your room. And so now think about like therapists, family that can't leave certain countries. Like there are all these other use cases that suddenly start to appear. Soccer games, right? So like think about this. People are thinking about booting professional sports back up to empty stadiums. Well, what happens when you can actually bring the stadium into like a holographic display in your living room? Like that even changes the way stadiums work altogether. So those are the things that are kind of starting to coalesce. And what happens is that you need to have a stadium full of sensors and special cameras that can do this stuff. But we're now at a place where we have the computational power, and as Tina was implying with her home usage, enough internet bandwidth to make this stuff possible.
See, I think that's so interesting too, because it's like, Like in my home, we've talked several times about what if we were doing this pandemic and it was back in the 90s, you know, what if we had been stuck here without the internet connection? You know, I have so much gratitude for the fact that I can video chat with my friends and my family and I'm not entirely cut off. And I can't imagine how, you know, much more heartbreaking it would be to be here without this technology. And not everyone has access to this technology even now, but that a lot of us are able to at least video chat with our friends and not feel quite so lonely. And so now your statement makes me wonder, you know, what does it look like if we see this kind of thing again in another 10 years or so, when we have more opportunities to access a greater bandwidth of technology. You know, one of the things I've noticed about the video calls is I keep saying to myself, well, it's definitely great. I'm extremely grateful for it. But I have to say, you know, when a real live person comes to my door to deliver something, you know, through the window, me and my very extroverted daughter were like, oh, there's a person coming to the door. Everyone come look, there's a real person. And I wonder if there's, you know, some amount of the VR that we might get will sort of help bridge that gap, that last gap of feeling like you want to be physically with someone in a physical space, you're walking around and talking to them. It might make things like this look different 10 years from now, 15 years from now.
Yeah, I had an experience recently where my wife is very much into the outdoors, and I tend to be the more kind of in the tech and kind of turning the screws on the hardware and the wacky headsets in my office. And so we're fortunate enough to have a couple of VR headsets in the house, and some friends on the East Coast. I'm in Phoenix, and some friends on the East Coast also have those headsets. And so we reached out and we said, hey, do you want to try to get together in some place that doesn't exist and have some fun without worrying about the 6 foot rule? And my wife, I think she was hesitant at first because it's tough to put on the headset, and it's big and bulky, and it's not super, I don't know, approachable yet. And that form factor will shrink, as all tech does, and it'll get sleeker and cooler and sexier, and will eventually not cost $1,500 to have something, you know, pretty solid. So we went and we played Frisbee golf, and we went to the woods in VR, and it was the coolest thing. Yeah, we didn't quite look like each other, but we still were ourselves. Like the amazing thing was that despite the fact that it was low resolution compared to real life, it was still a fun time walking around this Frisbee golf course with each other, with our friends, and high-fiving them, and you know, fist bumping them, and it was really cool. And she came out of it going, wow, that was actually, like you were saying about the people at the door, she's like, I felt like we just hung out with our friends for a couple of hours.
That's so great.
So I want to talk a little bit about you know, our personas, right? And you touched on this a little bit, Dennis. I think, you know, with you know, our digitally mediated personas, right? Like the genie's out of the bottle, right? You know, Facebook and Instagram are largely about like curating the best possible image of ourselves. But what I really liked about this story is that here we see VR being used to help someone explore new and differing versions of herself. And I wonder if we could talk a little bit about the specific affordances of VR for just this, for exploring, you know, exploring different versions of yourself, and also for, you know, for maybe fostering a greater sense of empathy.
Yeah, Tina, I mean, I was super interested in how you came to that realization within the character that it could be used a certain way. Like, I would imagine that you probably had some kind of personal introspection about the tech. And were there other use cases, or like what kind of questions were you asking yourself? Because that's interesting to me as a developer of this stuff. What's it going to take for people to use it, or like what's the right times to use it?
Yeah, that's really interesting. So, I mean, one of the things that I am interested with characters and with use of tech and stuff is, again, some of this stuff in the future or that we have now, things don't always work equally well for everyone. We all have different abilities, both physical, mental, different capabilities, different and different things why tech might work better or worse for us. And just as we sort of say, like, one of the things we talk about in science fiction sometimes is, like, if you watch a movie set in the like on a space station in the future, unless that movie is about everything failing, there's a lot of times where it's always like, in the future, all tech will be amazing and it'll work 100% of the time. And we all know that's not how tech works. That is not how it works at all. And so similarly, it doesn't work equally well for every person. As someone, I have anxiety myself, and I have some friends with anxiety. And so it's been interesting to me to see, like, the different ways that we have found video calls to work, because we can share the same, diagnosis or sense of self. And yet I have found people who, for the video call, ramps up their anxiety and makes it feel worse, because, and this was me when I first started, because I felt like I am sort of in a place with these people, but not really. And my body cannot pick up on all the subconscious cues that are going on. I used to do a lot of theater, and recently I've done some theater on Zoom calls as well. And it's really fun, but it's also really jarring at first, because in order for everyone to have a good experience, probably everyone else who's not talking is on mute. Therefore, you can make the funniest joke in the world and nobody's going to laugh at you. And you're like, oh my gosh, I'm failing as a comedian. And so you have this sort of, the feedback is different. And it's not what you're expecting. And then at the same time, I have some friends with anxiety who've found that the video has made it easier for them, to get more of that input. So I just think this is fascinating, the way that technology can be helpful or less helpful, or different things for different people. So in my story, Mila feels very anxious about using VR. She does not like the idea that people could be sort of, as you were just saying, Bob, with our curated media and our curated feeds, the idea in my future that she could be people could be curating their presence. Dennis, for example, I do kind of have the feeling that you might not be presenting your regular self to us today.
What?
What? But the idea that people might not be telling the truth about themselves, and that sort of has her anxiety ramped up. And at the same time, her sister says it makes her anxiety feel better, because you can be side Googling people and checking up on them while you are also talking to them. And so we have two sisters approaching it from very different angles. The one who just loves the tech and feels like it makes her whole life better, and the one who doesn't like it at all. But I was going to say, so also then when Mila is able to sort of try on her sister's avatar and inhabit that persona, that's a way that I found, like, because I was thinking, how could a sort of deep fake technology be used for good? And in this case, it gives Mila a comfort level when she does the volunteering of reading Harry Potter books to the children. She has that comfort level of, oh, I don't have to be myself at this moment. I'm going to be my sister, and my sister knows how to do this. So it's all good. We're all good.
I taught a class this past semester about video games and immersive systems. And one of the choices I made was to come in character for about half the courses. And we had one lecture on storytelling. And so I read your story, and we hadn't met before Bob and Joey put us together here. And you brought up Harry Potter. And one of the overwhelmingly positive reactions I got was storytelling in Harry Potter. Most of the students had grown up with Harry Potter. And so it took some work. I was talking to an artist friend of mine, and I was like, what's the next character? And he said, have you been a wizard yet? And I was like, oh, the universe is speaking to me. So I did a real-time deep fake where I was Harry Potter, and it was photorealistic.
And that's amazing.
Yeah. And I know that they appreciated it. It was, times are incredibly stressful right now, and to have, you know, little Einstein or Harry Potter in a conversation makes it a bit more approachable and just kind of more joyful, I think.
Yeah, and I was just reading an article that was like, you know, humans learn through play, and adults don't play enough, and we don't give ourselves permission to play. And you know what you've brought today is a very playful, fun thing that to bring to. We can't see you unless you make a noise, so you have to do it again. But a playful, joyful spirit to the class and stuff. I'm sure your students loved it.
I did, for sure.
That's all that matters.
Yeah, totally.
So I want to talk a little bit about, because we talk about, you know, kids growing up with this technology or with these characters. And I think when we hear about a digital native, the idea that young people have this sort of automatic skill and comfort with any new technology. But I mean, you know, that's largely a myth. So what was interesting about Tina's story is that it really talked about the different experiences with technology that kids have, and those anxieties using technology. So I wonder, how should we approach making technology accessible to all kinds of young people?
Yeah, that's a tough one, because on one hand, as a tech engineer enthusiast, I think, yes, the greater availability of these resources, of these tools, the more interesting use cases and uses of them you'll find. So in, you know, communities where there isn't an educator or there isn't a therapist or something, suddenly having these technologies give them access to those folks is super amazing. But on the other hand, I'm apprehensive about the amount of data or the amount of exposure a child may have to things that are not real. You know, like the personas on Instagram, right? I have relatives that are much younger than I am that are, you know, in their tweens and believe that what they're looking at is reality. And even photographs that have been tweaked of locations. I worry about reality letting them down in a way, right? And this is tough. I mean, I work in an industry that creates reality, some form of hyper reality, and so I struggle with this as well. That's a hard question, Bob, I think, especially for me. But I did appreciate, like I said before, that in Tina's story, there's a realization there that there may be the right time and the right place for a use of the tech. I would simply argue that if there's educational technology or something that will create joy and, calm or peace for people, I'm always a huge advocate for that, for getting that to as many people as fast as possible. But I also put up the red flag warning: technology adoption isn't always smooth or safe. And I think we've learned over the last decade how incredibly disruptive a billion people getting on the same system can be.
Mm-hmm.
That's a really interesting point. And it's also something I think about a lot. I have two kids, 6 and 9. So we're just starting to hit some of those, like how much technology do we consume? And of course that has greatly ramped up in the last 2 months, because before it was a lot easier to limit some of that stuff. And now we have schoolwork to do at home on laptops. And it's a lot of that stuff has increased, where we're having to make a lot more decisions every single day about which things are good ideas and which are not.
Marta in the Q&A brings up an interesting point. She says it's interesting the way that gender can be used in these spaces, because the other girl that Mila is reading to, that she develops a friendship with, she got injured And so she's avoiding boys hogging the skate ramp at her park. And so she's in VR partially because of that. And so Marta says online spaces have these interesting dynamics, but the story shows how a relationship between two young women can blossom in a space that they can control. So that's a great observation. Thank you, Marta. And feel free to put things down in the Q&A, put down your comments and your questions, and we will get to those. But yeah, to talk about that a little bit, does that bring up anything?
I just really like that observation. Thank you. Yeah. I don't know if that was, I don't think I had thought of that specifically when I was writing. I just like writing about women and girls. By and large, my writing focuses on that. So I think naturally my story just ended up being about 3 young women. But you have a really good point. The girl, Avery, is in the hospital because she was trying to skate at a time when the boys were not using the skate ramp. And yeah, that is a really interesting point. As a woman, it is often, the internet can be a fraught place, as we all know. So there's a lot of times I will talk to a guy about his use of social media, and it is a different experience than the one I have. Twitter feels just often like a minefield to me, and it is a place that I don't feel very comfortable going a lot because of the things, the ways that things can blow up on Twitter, and the way that people, women, people of color, people who are queer, people who are not, it can be harder. It can be harder. We'll just say that.
There's a system called Altspace, which was purchased a couple years ago by Microsoft. It was a small startup, and it was VR based. So you put on a headset and you can go to an old tavern or up to a spaceship or to a building, a fancy home somewhere. And one of the things that they realized really quickly, like within, 6 months of it going live, was that they needed to institute a new type of security tool, like one that people hadn't really needed before. And it's like a reality bubble. It's really cool, where you can basically specify the distance from you that you're comfortable with a 3-dimensional model appearing, like an avatar of someone else. So basically people were touching other people in virtual space in ways that made them uncomfortable. Mm-hmm. But this tool, this reality bubble tool, basically makes it so that the other persona the avatar starts to disappear at the distance from you that you're comfortable with. So whether that's 6 inches or 6 feet, you basically have control over who's around you. That has its pros and cons, but a tool like that, as far as I know, hadn't existed before. We hadn't had that problem. So in virtual space, what are the tools that are going to need to pop up to make these safe spaces for all kinds of people? There's a really interesting comic book called Alex plus Ada, and it's about a guy that falls in love with an android, but there's a virtual environment that is brought up in that comic book where there's like another safe kind of bubble where they instantiate a reality in which only the two of them exist. And so they can go to the park, or they can do things that are not okay in public, mm-hmm. in that private virtual space. So you can imagine, there are pros and cons, right? Because we should be some things should be acceptable in public, and sometimes they're not. I think about multiracial couples, like in the 1960s. My parents, my dad and my stepmom, right, are of 2 different races. And I remember even in DC in the 80s, walking into places and having them looked at, mm-hmm. getting stares. And I think, man, if they had met in VR, that wouldn't even be a thing. There are robots and talking gorillas in VR. So a couple doesn't even need to look like what we would expect a human couple to look at in those spaces. Just interesting insights. And And I do like that comment that was made, because I hadn't thought about that, but that's totally right. I guess toward the end of the story, I had a certain feeling about the kind of friendship that was starting to blossom there. And that's just really cool to know that you can find a space that's safe to have conversations, or to have joy with one another.
Mm-hmm.
Dennis, Lorelei brings up a point, building on your previous comment about social identity, like gender, race in VR. And she wants to know how people in the industry talk about these issues in environments where people can easily swap their avatars.
They do not enough. I will say adamantly that as an industry, we do a extremely lackluster job of discussing the type of customization that's necessary for all kinds of people. And I think the argument is often that, oh, it would take a lot of work, or we don't want to focus on that feature yet. And you end up with a system a few years down the line that doesn't acknowledge or celebrate all kinds of people. Mm-hmm. I mean, I wonder how many VR systems have wheelchairs, right? Mm-hmm. Like, we do a incredibly terrible job of acknowledging all kinds of people. And I would like to think that we'll have that discussion more as the technology becomes more available to more kinds of people. But it is a difficulty that we're having right now. And I think software and video games tend to have that problem.
Mm-hmm. Thinking about making the future more equitable and more accessible. I will say that this is the first YA tinge story for us in Flux. And so, Tina, I wondered if you might talk a little bit about YA literature and its role in telling stories about the future and getting young people engaged in discussions and conversations about the future.
Yay! Well, first off, I mean, I love both YA and middle grade literature, and I reading it and writing it. I think it's so important because growing up is all about, learning new things, encountering things for the first time, progressing beyond what you might have learned as a child from your family. I mean, some of the middle grade and YA books can be incredibly important in revealing, like, that there are other options out there that kids might not know about yet, that there are other ways of thinking, other ways of living. So, I mean, I think it's like one of the most important places to come and tell stories about the future, especially positive stories of hope and change. I mean, for example, I've got stuff behind me, but like my friend Jen Reese's book, A Game of Fox and Squirrels, it uses like the fantastical setting to talk about the fear of growing up with child abuse. And so this might be the first time that a young reader has encountered something like this in a book, and to see that there's a way forward, a way out of this stuff. Some of these are behind me. This is useful. Carlos Hernandez, his Sal and Gabby series, like, they do what I keep calling the My Little Pony thing of talking about, like, a world where people can make mistakes and try and do again, and most people are like positive and working towards a better and equitable future. So I think middle grade and YA are just, like, I'm biased obviously, but I just think it's one of the most important and wonderful places to tell stories.
Awesome. So we have some questions in the Q&A, and please contribute to the Q&A, add some comments, add some questions, and we will get to those in just a few. Our friend David Staley, hi David, says that he's less concerned about children or adults experiencing too much of what is not real, because since the first cave paintings, we've long inhabited the not real.
Yeah, I love that comment. And so there's that back and forth of the real and the not real. The class that I taught was called Designing the Illusion of Reality. And it takes its inspiration actually from an older book that's used to teach Disney animators called The Illusion of Life. And I think he's totally hit the nail on the head there, that even this, like all of this, like our houses and our paintings and and the society that we live in is a construct, right? Like it's real in the sense that we can touch it, but it's also an idea that we've all agreed to. So reality itself is quite malleable, and I think we often forget that, and it's very empowering. And I would imagine, I mean, simply like I think about the reactions I got from the students I had. They were interested in changing the world, informing it, and they realized the power of immersive systems to do that. So if you want to create an environment that looks like Wakanda, that you can walk through and interact with people, well, you can do that today, right now. It doesn't have to exist in a movie. It can be a place. And if you want to have a society where we're all, of a certain kind. However, I also, again, that red flag is that can be used for nefarious purposes. And we have to be very cautious about what those things look like and what they're used for, because they, it's like any mass media, it can be devastating when used in the wrong way. You can take billions of people to war on things that are totally fabricated. And we just have to be cautious of things like that. I do like the idea of, like, in the future, having some of my heroes be people that I can walk down the street with, right? Whether it's like a famous author or an illustrator or a fictional character. Like, there's going to be a reality very soon, probably within 5 years, where Harry Potter will be someone that you can sit beside and have a conversation about the books with.
And I mean, that'll be really cool. I have to say, my 9-year-old and me would love that.
Jerome asks, so many visions of the future position technology as dangerous, like you see in Black Mirror. Tina's story is refreshingly positive, showing technology's drawbacks, but also the cool new things it allows us to do. Tina, how do you create stories that are gripping without being dystopian?
Thank you. Great question. Something I ask myself every day. When I first started writing, I think a lot of times I was drawn to, like, dark stories can sometimes be easier to tell because, if you come out with, you have a villain and you have bad things and then more bad things, it can be easier to find that tension. But at some point I realized, these are not the stories that I love as a reader. I want to read stories where it's more, I keep coming back to My Little Pony, but it's like stories where people are trying hard to make things better. So yeah, when I wanted, and sometimes that can be hard too with science fiction, because a lot of times when I come up with like a new idea or a new character, I'm like, oh, this is a depressing idea. I guess it goes in the science fiction pile, because sometimes it feels like all the technology around us is just, obviously it's going to be turned to ill, turned to bad things. So what did I do for this one? I wanted, so since I'm really interested in characters anyway, I'm just really interested in people and how they do things and make choices. And I'm also a strong advocate of Flash, a very short story, as a way to tell stories. I just think it's a very powerful medium that is underappreciated, but it's amazing. But so it allows you to really focus down on a very small turning point, a very small moment. So in this case, I was able to take, Mila's anxiety, her worry that she was going to fail her sister and not at her sister's volunteering, or she was going to make a fool of herself, or she'd have social anxiety with making a mistake talking to the kids or talking to Avery. So I took those worries and tried to build my tension around that to make that feel like a very real thing that we all can relate to, going into an unfamiliar social situation and worry about what we're going to do and how we're going to say and what idiotic things are going to come out of our mouth, and take that and turn it into a very small moment of looking at, okay, when did that change for her? When did things start to get better? And in this case, finding that connection with Avery, finding a friend, finding someone who feels about some of these things the way that she does, that she can relate to, and that she can have a positive experience with the medium.
I want to make sure that I get this. Thank you for all of your questions so far. Terry asks, talking about storytelling in all of its different forms, flash fiction being a good one. How does storytelling work in VR spaces? How do you tell a story? And this is for you, Dennis. How do you tell a story in an immersive space, and what works and what doesn't the medium allow for?
Yeah, that's a really great question. There was kind of this rush to create 360-degree immersive videos about 4 or 5 years ago. And so different schools have the editing tools to do that. It's pretty off-the-shelf stuff that you would normally use to create a movie or a short film. The problem is that the camera is everywhere. And how do you get a person to focus on a certain place in that 360 sphere? And so that was a very early problem that was recognized. And in some cases, what folks would do is they would actually make half of that sphere. So if you can imagine looking around, half of the world, which is the world that we don't want you paying attention to or focusing on, being static. So there's no animation going on. There's no, imagine half that camera in that 360 sphere is just a picture. And then everything in front of you would be moving, right? The storyline's happening in front of you. And so that was kind of an early way of managing that. What's evolved is that now there's something called volumetric capture. And volumetric capture really is a way of capturing the world in a three-dimensional format so that you can walk through it. That's what most people will consider really VR. Being able to walk through a thing, open a door, climb some stairs, that kind of thing. It's much more like staging a play in that way, where you have to basically make sure that you know the distance you want things to be from the observer. And the play is happening so that you have control over the lights. So let's say you want to look up at that second story window. One thing you might do is kind of force the environment to close all the other windows or all the lights turn off. I'm thinking right now of Rear Window, right? Of Hitchcock's Rear Window. How would you do Rear Window standing inside the courtyard in that film? It's stage design. You have to know where to place the actors. You have to know where to place the props. And speaking to props, there was a really interesting interview done a few years ago with an award-winning VR video game maker. And this gentleman built a tea kettle and a teacup, and he put out all the things that would be required to make the tea. And he handed it over to his wife, and his wife goes in VR, and she starts banging at stuff. And he brings her back out, and he's like, "What's your problem? What are you doing?" And she goes, "Listen, you don't put all the parts to create tea and not have them be interactive. It just doesn't work. Human beings want to open the box. They want to open the door. They want to break the thing. So if you're not going to allow that, remove it from the scene, because it's just going to frustrate them and frustrate me." And so what's happened is kind of these affordances, yes, is a sense of hyper reality or reality inside of the simulated environment. But then if you have a ton of books, if you put somebody in a library in VR and they can't open a single book, the illusion is gone.
Yeah.
And so imagine the amount of work required to make all the books readable. That's significant. The game Skyrim tends to kind of allow for that to happen, and there are over 150 hours of content, of interactive content in Skyrim. But that means that they've had to generate all the lore, all the songs, all the book entries, all the journals. That's a ton of work. So those are ways in which VR is different. You can control the camera much more in a 2-dimensional game or like a 3D game played flat. But in VR, you're basically saying everything that you see you can reach, or everything that you can touch you can interact with. And that is quite a bit more complicated in the planning stage.
Yeah, that's so interesting, because it's like, we talk about when you're writing a novel that there's like an iceberg effect that, you may have built 90% of that world, but the reader only sees the top 10%, which means that you can kind of hint at the tales and the lore and the songs without having to let everybody explore all of it, right? So gosh, that's so interesting. I'm really fascinated by all the different forms of storytelling. And that just got me thinking about the, so stage plays, there's been, some of them have come into more fashion lately, where where the audience can walk around and see all the things. And I've forgotten the name. There was a Macbeth one that was in New York a few years back, and I can't think of its name right now, but you can walk around and see all the different scenes happening and interact with all the things. But it requires a different sort of, it requires the actors to be doing different stuff, and it requires a different kind of setting. And some of those have been around for a while. I was in a production of Tony and Tina's Wedding, which was one of the early interactive ones from the 90s, where you go and you're at a big Italian wedding and everyone's acting wild and it's nuts. But it means, if you're in a space where the audience isn't controlled as to what they're watching, that involves a very different sort of thing that you're setting up, and probably the amount of like repetition of important things too. Because one of the things we say if you're writing a play is that you have to repeat certain facts over so that the audience gets them. Like if you're trying to set up a science fictional world in a play, you're going to have to repeat things, because it's not a book where the reader can just go back and be like, okay, how did the dragons work again? And so I would imagine that you also have to, if you can't control exactly what order things are going to happen in and where they're going to go, that would involve a lot of different narrative setups. So really interesting.
Yeah. There's some of my favorites kind of do this real natural transition into an enclosed space. So you might be out in the open and have to climb up a tower, and then you climb up the tower and then the door locks shut. So now you're in this controlled space, so that when the dragon flies around the window, you can't touch the dragon. Whereas if the door's open, everybody's going to run out and try to touch the dragon. And now, guess what? You got to have a fully animated, touchable dragon.
Right.
And so there's these like very organic ways of kind of compression and then opening, expansion. Just really interesting design, like transitions. Just stairs are really interesting. Doors into smaller rooms are interesting, doors that lock on their own. And it's a different way, kind of expanding on ideas that have been learned through virtual reality. And so filmmakers, I've met some filmmakers. We actually had dinner a few months ago with a filmmaker who said, I hate VR. I tried it and it's not what I went to school for, and I'm not comfortable with it, and I just don't think it's the type of story I'd want to tell, at least right now, as the tech exists. Right now, I don't have the amount of control I'd like to have. And that was really elucidating. That was like, oh, okay. It's not that she doesn't like VR. She doesn't have the control that she expects to have as a director.
Mm-hmm.
So thinking about different kinds of reality, there's this storytelling reality that we can control and we can direct, and then we have our our outside reality, or a different version of reality, the one that we're living in right now, which is very disrupted. So I wonder how we can use this story to think about our current predicament and maybe direct our external reality in positive ways.
Well, one of the things I wanted to get into this story is thinking about a positive future where some of this, so right now we're all shifting to tech, we're shifting to Zoom calls, we're shifting to, if we're lucky enough to get to work from home, then we are trying to make that happen. Um, uh, my partner is like a transportation activist, so he's always doing a lot of work on trying to make streets safer for bikes and for transit. And so we've talked a lot about what that might look like. And so one of the things I was thinking of with this story that I threw in a couple lines about is just the idea that maybe it would be a positive thing is maybe if we were in more of a post-oil scenario, and we're less reliant on oil, less reliant on cars, that some of this stuff had shifted to where people could do things like in the story, they're doing hospital volunteering online. The girls, one of the girls is doing school online, the other one is biking to her school. And that they can, that we can find ways to do some things remotely while still building that sort of connection and community. And I also threw in a line about a bike-powered home generator, just because that's something we keep saying, boy, wouldn't it be nice if the kids had to pedal the bike in order to watch the TV? So that's part of my future too.
Yeah, that's great. I have a few nieces and nephews that even just reading to them, this has totally made something else possible. And not that it wasn't possible, it just, we couldn't see it before for whatever reason, like out of habit or whatever. But reading to kids, which is directly addressed in your story, it's not a technically ambitious thing to do. So even as the persona I'm in right now, I've thought a lot about why wouldn't I do this to read, to have a stream that's reading to folks. And it doesn't have to just be kids. Like we all like stories. I mean, we all have things that we think about and dreams that we have. And so just being able to do that now, for whatever reason, seems a little more acceptable. Mm-hmm. And I think what's interesting as a technologist and a futurist myself, like I think of things like, there was a time when dating online had a certain, ring to it. There will be a time, I hope, where, oh, I logged onto that stream to have a puppet read to me, is not something that we freak out about. What do you mean? Like that's weird. Like it shouldn't be. It's okay as long as you aren't harming someone or they're not harming you. Like having a story told to you by a stranger through a live stream is not a big deal.
Yeah, I read the most fascinating article, gosh, at least 5 years ago, and it was about how advertisers, it was about trying to get people to change their grocery store habits in this particular article, and the data mining that comes along with that. And it mentioned that one of the main times in which people will just completely change their allegiance to their grocery store and start out a whole new one is when they're pregnant. So the article was about Target trying to identify when women were pregnant before they knew that they were pregnant, if I'm remembering this article correctly. Yeah. Which I think I am. And of course that caused some difficulties for some people in the article, which was very interesting. But on a positive side, like, again, I'm speaking with gratitude here that my life is, we've been able to shelter in place, and I'm very grateful that we've been able to do that and stay home here in my family. But the possible positive side of having everybody's habits disrupted is that it kind of gives you a chance to make some new habits. And similarly to your reading to your nieces, Dennis, my family is now having weekly Zoom calls, which is great with the grandparents and with all my siblings. There's 4 siblings and then my parents, and before that it'd been like we should really do that sometime. And everybody had there was some tech hang-ups and everyone had different schedules, and you had to teach mom how to get on the internet or whatever, you know, others. But now all of a sudden, everything was thrown up in the air and it came back down again in a way that it's like, yes, we're doing this. We're doing it every week. And at the same time in which I'm so, I'm so regretful about all the people I don't get to see in person that I'm missing. I'm getting to see new people, new friends that live across the country that ordinarily we wouldn't have thought to set up a video call. You know, I'll just see you at the next convention. And now like we're scheduling times to meet up, and I'm so grateful for that. So it's like at the same time that I'm losing connections, I've also gained some. And so I can find the gratitude in that and those habits changing.
I love that. That's great. So that's about all of our time. I want to thank everyone for their great questions. Thanks for watching. Thank you both for being here, Tina and Dennis. Can you let people know where to find you and how to follow your work?
Sure. I am at tinaconnolly.com. One of my my Lighthearted YA series is Seriously Wicked. I'm also currently doing a podcast called Toasted Cake, which I've actually been doing for several years, but right now we're doing a run of hope. So it's all positive or hopeful or in some way positive flash stories weekly, and that's at toastedcake.com.
And I can be found at Harbinger Alpha on Twitter and Instagram. That's HARBINGERALPHA. And I am, for fun, running well, not for fun, but for use, I'm running a website called Live Quarantine, which is a site that you can upload any live stream that you're involved with and advertise it to anybody else for free. And then I run a monthly VR for Good meetup here in Tempe, Arizona. You can find it on Meetup just under Phoenix VR for Good. And that's how you can find me.
Awesome. Thank you both. You can find us at the Center for Science and the Imagination at csi.asu.edu. You can follow us on social media at ImaginationASU, and you can catch up, and you should read all the previous stories in our Us in Flux series. That's on csi.asu.edu/usinflux. Our next story in the series is Fourth and Most Important by Nisi Shawl. We'll publish that on Thursday, May 28th, with a live online conversation on Monday, June 1st. So we look forward to seeing you then. Until then, stay safe, stay well, read some good books, maybe set up a Zoom call and read to a stranger. Until then, thanks so much. And
thank you.
Be well.
Thank you.
Thanks.